Hi everyone, welcome to Gartner Live. I'm Jackie Wiles, Associate Director of Content Marketing at Gartner, and today I'm joined by Caroline Walsh, VP in our HR practice, and we're going to be talking about how to build a resilient organization. Hey Caroline, thanks for joining us today.
Hi Jackie, it's nice to see you.
So Caroline, we're hearing all the time these days how important it is to be resilient, responsive, adaptive. We've obviously had a huge amount of business disruption to get through. But what does it actually mean about what organizations need to do and change to be resilient for the long term, and how that sort of compares with what we've been doing up until now to respond to everything we've had to do immediately?
Jackie, a lot of the organizations that we worked with before the pandemic were really focused on efficiency. And so what that meant was that they were trying to drive growth through creating very clear processes, sometimes even really rigid processes. All employees knew where they were supposed to be, when, a lot of standardization. That all worked really well for many organizations prior to the pandemic. But what we've seen is that during this time of unprecedented change, this efficiency has actually become fragility and has made organizations really vulnerable to dealing with the change. So where we see organizations that we're working with headed now is, instead of moving towards efficiency, actually moving towards resilience. So what that looks like in practice is organizations focusing on making sure that they have their resources, their talent, their work design, all designed and deployed, ready to sense and respond to these continuous changes. Now, one thing that's been really interesting is that as we've seen organizations come through the pandemic and come through the early months of the pandemic, we saw that a lot of organizations were actually able to respond with a lot of speed. But we haven't been able to see them sensing and responding over and over again. And that over and over again is what's really important. We need to set up for the long haul. And so we're helping organizations now set up for sustained resilient success.
Yeah, I think that's a great scene setting. And what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about two specific sort of components of components of resilience, one of which is skills and one is work design. So before we get to our conversation, just a reminder to everyone that you can ask questions of Caroline. We'll be returning to those at the end. So go ahead and put them in the comments box if you have any questions as we go along. But Caroline, let's talk about the skills piece. So obviously, acquiring critical skills has been a huge priority for organizations for a while. So what is it about the skills issue that is so important for resilience in particular?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Jackie, for resilience, I think the big challenges when it comes to acquiring critical skills is actually the volume of skills required today and the fact that these skills are changing so rapidly. So what we've actually found is that for the average job, the number of skills required has increased 10% year on year. Now, at the same time as that's happening, the number of new skills needed, about half of the skills needed for a job today are new. And then those new skills are displacing old skills. So we're left with organizations asking how they can find the right skills in the right place at the right time.
Right. So is that sort of changing how organizations view employees as a resource and the relationship they therefore have with employees and other workers?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, sort of back to this idea of the pre-pandemic times when organizations were focusing on maximizing efficiency, when they were looking to sort of also improve capacity. Their go-to was often the traditional full-time workforce. And I think this is going to be familiar to a lot of the people on the line. When organizations in these pre-pandemic times, pre-resilience times, needed to improve efficiency, they would look to the alternative workforce for that efficiency boost. Now, we're seeing a lot of organizations switch to a more dynamic point of view. And so what that means is that they're beginning to ask questions, wondering how and where and when can work get done to maximize productivity and engagement. And they're also asking who is right to get work done, whether it is people inside the organization or outside the organization. One piece there that's important to think about is as they're asking who is right to get this work done, a lot of organizations that we're working with are focusing on shaping the workforce. What this means is that these organizations are prioritizing skills instead of hiring profiles. And when they're going out and they're looking for new talent, they're actually looking to the total skills marketplace instead of traditional talent pools. One example, just in case it's helpful for folks to understand, one organization that we worked with was interested in hiring new software developers, pretty common need for organizations today. What a lot of organizations in this situation would do is to go externally first and would go to those traditional talent pools. So would go to folks who had university degrees, who had computer science background, people from other parts of the tech industry, people with IT experience. Well, this organization that we worked with instead first said, okay, we need software developers, but what are the real skills that we need? So they need software development skills. So first they went inside their organization and they actually found a lot of people within their organization who were not in software development roles, but who had software development skills. So they were able to broaden their look internally. Then they were actually able to look externally, but beyond the traditional pools. So they were able to look for people who were self-taught, so who may not have had a university degree or who may have had a university degree in something else, in anthropology, right? They were also able to look at neurodiverse candidates, but who had software development experience. So all this to say that sort of widening the aperture to look at skills can be really helpful. One thing to mention, though, as organizations are doing this, one really key point is you and I know, many of the people on the line today know that there are very rapid changes in what both employees and candidates are expecting in terms of the employment value proposition. This is changing day to day, sort of never before, like the last 6 months. And so as organizations are looking to shape the workforce, it's also imperative that HR leaders are able to be thoughtful about building a responsive EVP.
So, but it sounds very much though like this sort of developing hybrid workforce approach can actually deliver significant benefits to both sides of the equation, to both employers and to employees and candidates.
You're exactly right, Jackie. We believe that the hybrid work approach, the hybrid workforce model, has to have benefits for both the organization and for employees and for candidates. At Gartner, we think of this hybrid work approach as really a shared approach where employees and managers and leaders at the organization all actually share remote work and hybrid work decisions. So this is going to look a little different than what many organizations are used to. First, it means that organizations, that employees and managers are going to have a common set of expectations that employees will move dynamically from location to location, and they'll do so without a fixed pattern. It also means that the decision about where and when work gets done is not going to be mandated from the organization. It's going to be based on what makes the most sense to drive productivity and employee engagement. So this is all a really new world for a lot of the organizations we work with. One thing that I'm going to anticipate your next question here, Jackie. I think one thing that's really important that a lot of folks ask about is how do we do this? And what we're finding is that one of the big prerequisites for this hybrid workforce model to work is trust between the managers and employees in particular. So managers need to trust that employees are going to work productively, that they're going to work effectively, and in turn, employees need to be flexible and they need to be comfortable being mobile.
And that presumably has to extend even to people who are not employees and who are gig or other workers who are brought into the work streams but aren't actually full-time employees. That same trust and responsibility and shared agreement on how work gets done extends to them too.
Absolutely. And this hybrid workforce model really opens a lot of doors for organizations as they're considering who is an employee and who is helping get work done. Again, who has those skills. And one thing about the hybrid model is that it allows organizations to go after those critical skills that are going to give them that competitive advantage. And it allows them to do so by broadening where they're looking. They can look for remote workers. They can look for workers in lower cost locations. So they can save both those facilities costs and also those talent acquisition costs.
Great. So let's move on the conversation to the work design piece, which is equally evolving. I'm going to remind people that they can be asking questions of Caroline, and we'll revert to those later. Caroline, I know there's been, the HR practices have done a lot of research on this too, in terms of work design. And I think let's set the scene again by saying, we have seen a huge amount of progress, a huge amount of success. We've done things we didn't think were possible, but still organizations are challenged in being responsive, right? In their everyday work and how work gets done.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to key in there for a minute on this word you used, responsive, because that's a little bit different than what we've been talking about so far, and it's important. So when we talk about responsive employees, we mean employees who can sense and respond to changing customer needs, and that these employees are actually able to design their work around doing that. So they spend most of their day doing that. When I talk about customers, often this means external customers. It means the clients that our organizations serve, but it also means internal customers. A lot of the HR leaders that I work with, that my team works with, are really interested right now in making their HR function more agile and more able to respond quickly to business unit leads, to questions from their finance department, for example. What we found, though, was a little bit upsetting, a little bit worrying. Our research found that even though this responsiveness sounds great, it's important, especially now during these times of fast change, HR leaders noted that less than 20% of their workforce is actually able to change direction in response to changing client needs and priorities. So this is a clear problem, especially today, where as priorities change, as clients change, as just everything changes, if employees are out of step with that, that's something that we need to address quickly.
And so how do employees themselves feel? Do they feel they can be responsive and know how to be responsive?
Jackie, this is the piece that's really, it was a little surprising to me. It was surprising to the team, but maybe it shouldn't have been. Employees want to be responsive. And actually 90% of employees, we did a huge survey of thousands of employees around the world. 90% of these employees actually have the mindset and the skills necessary to be responsive. But what we found is that in the day-to-day work, less than 40% are actually working responsibly.
Yikes. That's quite a gap. So what did you find were the reasons for employers being unable to be as responsive as their organizations want them to be?
Yeah. Well, this is where this idea that is just really powerful, I think, comes in. And it's this idea of work friction and friction in work design. And so what we found, we often talk about skill, will, and hill. So we know that employees had the skill and the will to make that change and to be responsive. Work friction is the hill that's preventing them from doing it. And what we found was that there were actually 4 primary kinds of friction that had an outsized impact on preventing employee responsiveness. So And I think these are going to be unfortunately familiar to many of the people that we have with us right now. The first is that workflows are misaligned to the way that work actually gets done. And so you're supposed to do work one way, and yet it just never actually happens that way. The next is that teams are overwhelmed. And this is something that we've seen in particular since the start of the pandemic. Teams are overwhelmed. They don't know how to prioritize what they should do first. The next is that resources are trapped, and they're trapped in old budgets. So resources can't be deployed where they are needed as circumstances change. And then finally, that processes are rigid. And so a lot of this, back to this idea of efficiency, we drove towards rigid processes to drive towards standardization. And now we're finding that rigidity actually holds us back from responding to change.
So I'd like to sort of end our conversation with maybe some examples of like what this actually looks like in practice. But just another quick reminder, I know we're already getting questions, but we'll continue to take your questions if you want to put them in the comments box. But I think this idea of getting a grip on what is exactly stopping people from doing what they need to do. I think it's interesting because as you said at the beginning, we as organizations are really proud of everything that many of us have achieved during this time, and we've been incredibly responsive, and we've actually managed, as we mentioned earlier, to achieve things we actually didn't know we could do. And so I think it's worth sort of coming back here to have you reinforce that this is what we're talking about, how to sustain this for the long term, because we all know what it's like to be burned out from getting things done, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're doing them in a way that's sustainable and repeatable. So can you give us sort of an example of, one of these types of work friction, and, what kinds of things you can do to change the approach to that piece of work design to make things more sustainable for everyone, for employees and for the organization?
Absolutely. And I think you're right on that we do need to congratulate ourselves for this sort of short-term success. We've worked really hard, but it is not sustainable. So back to this idea of friction. One key friction, the last one I mentioned, these rigid processes. Often organizations have really clear lines about what employees can and cannot do. What that might look like is when a new idea comes in, organizations go really quickly to the idea of no. It's a no first environment. And they do that because you just don't want to deviate from the standard process. What we found is that when that happens, and maybe you all have experienced some of this in the last few months, when this happens, employees actually take to hacking their work. So what this means is they find ways to work around the process that isn't working for them. And so, for example, they might, if they have a new initiative they want to bring about, they might go through every step they can to not seek approval for it. So they don't have to get that no. Now, while this sounds innovative and maybe sounds exciting and problem solving, the reality is that these types of hacks can actually cost organizations quite a bit of time and money and energy. They also introduce quite a bit of risk into a situation that is not ideal. So what organizations can do instead is actually move from a no to a go. So we're helping organizations see where they can move the bar on what requires an approval, so that we can actually go to a place of yes, where appropriate. But I do want to just circle back for a minute to where you started the question, on talking about sort of all that we've been through. And you're right. What we actually have seen is that employee engagement and productivity in some instances have increased across the pandemic. But I think we're all feeling it. We're all feeling that we are managing to get work done, but it is hard. And so I think during the pandemic, we've seen this sort of increased employee work, we've seen some of these frictions be temporarily removed. We've seen processes change overnight. We've seen resources where we no longer have to meet in an office. Resources are a Zoom call away. That's great, but that is not sustainable. As organizations move back to more normal workflows, there's a lot of risk of losing ground here, and also of just not designing. We can't just design around hacks all the time. And so it's really important that organizations look at these key friction points and design work accordingly to build that sustained resilience to get us through this.
So I'm going to turn to a couple of questions from our viewers, and I actually think this is a good level set question. Madhu from India asks whether you can explain really what you mean by work design. And I think you've covered with your examples of friction, sort of the basic areas, but just talk to that for a minute, because it isn't just, a process that, moves from A to Z, right? There are so many pieces of work design. Just run through us for a minute what you're talking about when you're talking about the kinds of components that need to change in order to build resilience for the long term.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when we think about work design, we're talking about a lot of things. We're talking about really all the ways in which work gets done. And I think those 4 friction components are really important as we're thinking through it. So part of it is just sort of your basic workflows. It's the basic processes, but then it's also the ability to get the resources you need when you need them. So as you think about your day-to-day, it's really all of the inputs that allow you to move through your work and get it done. And as we look at sort of this desire to be more responsive, and then in turn, this desire to be more resilient, we're seeing that really all elements of that design, from the processes, the workflows, the sort of team, how teams are structured, we see all of those falling apart in different points of friction.
So I actually have 3 questions here, which I'm sort of going to meld together. So Zoff from the UAE, Jessica from Portugal, and Jason from Salt Lake City are all essentially asking about how realistic it is to upskill, reskill versus acquire internally and using a hybrid workforce model during highly disruptive times. I guess my question to you, sort of summarizing what their concerns are, is, I think that from what I've read of your research, the assumption is that the hybrid workforce model is now how you work. It has benefits for everyone, and it's a need. So this is what it's going to look like. Mm-hmm. But are there some sort of best practice first steps you can be sharing about what kind of decisions you make when you decide, are we going to try and reskill internally, or are we simply going to try and acquire those skills we need at this moment in time and going forward? What's that reskill versus acquisition equation look like?
Yeah, it's a great question, and what is right is going to vary so much from organization to organization. But one piece that I think is really interesting about the hybrid workforce model is that it's really a freeing model. If we take this idea that work is unbounded, that work can get done anywhere, anytime, as long as the employees have the right skills to get it done, that suddenly opens up the whole world. And it opens us up to think about part-time workers, gig workers, full-time workers. I love that this question came from a global pool of questioners, right. Because really we could imagine a lot of the organizations we work with are now getting work done across all those areas. So I think as we think about that, the first step and the piece to keep in mind is really breaking down what we typically do. We think of a role first and breaking that down into the component skills. And that will be the first step to then allowing organizations to see where they can go. It also gets to that question of reskilling. There are, I think, many moments when organizations have the skills they need already. They just don't have them necessarily matched to the role that they need. And so reskilling isn't even necessarily an issue to begin with. That's something that can come in later.
Well, I would love to sit here all day because we have other questions, but it's about time for us to wrap up. So Caroline, I want to say thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a great conversation. To our viewers, if you want to learn more about organizational resilience, you can check out an ebook. I think we're sharing the descriptor, but you can also search Gartner.com for how to build a resilient organization. And also be sure to register for the upcoming Gartner Reimagine HR conference. We've gone virtual this year. Everyone's very excited to be doing 2 days of virtual conferencing. That'll take place October 13th to 15th. Again, you can find the details on Gartner.com. So Caroline, again, thanks very much for joining us. Really great to have you. We'll see you all again soon.
Thank you, Jackie. Thanks, everyone.